The morning began the way Keanu Reeves preferred it, quiet, unhurried, and wrapped in the soft gold of a California sunrise. His home sat at the end of a peaceful cul-de-sac, shaded by eucalyptus trees and framed by flowers a neighbor's child once planted for him. But today, that serenity fractured the moment he opened the sleek, cream-colored envelope sitting in his mailbox. The HOA seal was embossed on the front, heavy and official, the kind of paper meant to unsettle rather than inform. Keanu stood by the gate, Shadow, his massive black and gray rescue dog, nudging his elbow curiously as he unfolded the letter. As his eyes scanned the printed lines, his brows lowered subtly. It wasn't anger that moved across his face. Keanu rarely let anger write his expressions. It was disappointment. The HOA had issued a formal complaint, labeling Shadow as dangerous, aggressive, and a potential threat to community safety. They claimed 3 residents had filed reports expressing fear about the dog's presence. Shadow sensed the shift instantly. The dog wasn't conventionally handsome. He was big, bigger than most dogs allowed in HOA communities, broad-shouldered, scar-laced from a past no one fully understood, with a solemn intensity in his eyes. But he was gentle, profoundly loyal, and almost impossibly intuitive. With a soft whine, he pushed his head under Keanu's hand. Keanu looked down and offered a faint smile, smoothing the fur between Shadow's ears. "It's all right," he murmured, not to reassure himself, but to reassure the dog. Keanu knew why Shadow patrolled the yard at night. It wasn't aggression, it was vigilance. He had been trained as a search and rescue dog long before Keanu adopted him, and despite the trauma buried in his past, his instincts were still sharp. What the HOA saw as intimidation was, in truth, protection. He stepped inside, letter in hand, and read it fully at his kitchen counter. The language was clinical, almost sterile. It cited several incidents: Shadow barking loudly during late hours, Shadow growling at a passerby. Keanu remembered that day. The man had been walking a drone-like device close to Keanu's property, and Shadow had merely given a warning stance. And a blurry video someone had submitted showing Shadow sprinting across Keanu's yard, chasing a raccoon. The HOA interpreted it as aggressive pursuit behavior. Keanu exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that deflated tension rather than released anger. Bureaucracy, he thought. A system that saw rules but rarely saw context. The letter demanded his appearance at a mandatory HOA hearing in 48 hours. Failure to appear would result in escalating fines and possible removal of the dog from the community. Shadow rested his chin on Keanu's knee as he reread the final line. "For the safety and peace of the neighborhood, action must be taken." For a long moment, Keanu remained still. His fingers traced the paper, not out of worry, but contemplation. Shadow was more than a pet. He was family. He had saved Keanu's life once, literally pulled him from under a collapsed platform during a stunt rehearsal years ago. Keanu had been trapped and losing consciousness, but Shadow had refused to leave him, barking until help arrived, dragging at Keanu's jacket with everything he had. That memory lived permanently behind Keanu's eyes, surfacing every time someone misread Shadow's scars as violence instead of survival. Keanu folded the letter neatly, set it aside, and crouched to meet Shadow's gaze. "We've dealt with worse," he whispered. And they had, together. By late afternoon, the news of the complaint had already trickled through the neighborhood gossip channels. Keanu noticed the shift during his early walk with Shadow. Neighbors who once waved hesitated now. A few crossed the street instead of passing him. Some watched from behind curtains. Shadow didn't react. He walked calmly beside Keanu, head slightly bowed, tail neutral but alert. The air carried an unspoken judgment, one that stung not because it targeted Keanu, but because it targeted Shadow, who had done nothing but protect the people who feared him. As they returned home, Keanu paused at the gate, looking at the houses surrounding him. The community believed they were keeping themselves safe from Shadow. They had no idea that, one day soon, this dog they distrusted would be the only reason their HOA president lived to see another morning. For now, Keanu stepped inside, closed the gate, and prepared himself for the hearing ahead, unaware that fate was already planning a storm far louder than any complaint letter. The HOA meeting room was located inside the community recreation center, an unassuming space with beige walls, a long laminate table, and chairs arranged in rigid rows that felt more like a courthouse than a neighborhood gathering. Keanu arrived 5 minutes early, Shadow waiting at home per HOA policy. He walked through the low hum of whispered conversations, each voice dipping just slightly as he passed, as though his presence was a disruption rather than an inclusion. Keanu took a seat near the front, posture relaxed, fingers loosely intertwined, expression unreadable. The board members filed in shortly after, shuffling papers, adjusting glasses, the air suddenly thick with procedural importance. At the center was Mr. Harold Dalton, the HOA president, a man whose sense of authority was stitched so tightly into his identity that even his suit seemed to stand at attention. His eyes swept the room and landed briefly on Keanu. Not hostile, but firm, detached. Dalton began the meeting with a stern recitation of policy. Tonight, we are addressing a violation regarding an aggressive animal within the community. Not once did he use Shadow's name. In bureaucratic environments, removing a name from a situation removed the humanity, or in this case, the soul, connected to it. A large display monitor flickered to life beside the board. One of the members, a sharp-featured woman named Mrs. Halpern, clicked through digital files. Blurry photos of Shadow pacing along Keanu's fence line at night, a brief clip of him barking loudly during a thunderstorm, another showing him charging across the yard after a raccoon. Each image was framed as evidence, stripped of context and fairness. Several attendees murmured their concerns, nodding as if confirmation bias were a shared language. When it was his turn to speak, Keanu rose slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm presence alone shifted the room. Shadow is a search and rescue trained dog, Keanu explained. He's not aggressive, he's vigilant. He responds to movement at night because it's what he was trained to do. The growling incident, he was warning off a device being flown too close to my property. The chase video, that was a raccoon. He wasn't threatening anyone. His tone remained respectful, measured, factual. He spoke with clarity and purpose, but the board members exchanged glances, already entrenched in their original positions. Shadow has lived with me for years, Keanu added. He's never harmed anyone. Not once. His final words, though quiet, carried a weight that haloed the room. Dalton adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Mr. Reeves, with all due respect, your dog's past training doesn't negate the fear he's causing residents. We have rules to maintain peace. Large animals with unpredictable behavior are a liability. The word liability hung in the air like a verdict. Keanu held Dalton's gaze for a long moment, calm, unwavering, but laced with a disappointment that softened rather than sharpened his features. Fear isn't always fact, Keanu replied. Sometimes it's just unfamiliarity. His response stirred a few murmurs. A young mother near the back subtly lowered the hand she had raised in concern. But for every shifting opinion, another remained stubbornly fixed. The board retreated briefly for deliberation, though it was more procedural performance than necessity. They had already made up their minds. When they returned, Dalton read the decision in a tone devoid of personal nuance. We are granting a temporary grace period of 7 days. During this time, you are required to demonstrate improved control over your animal's behavior. Failure to do so will result in progressive fines and potential removal of the animal from the property. A ripple of whispers swept across the room, but Keanu remained still. He wasn't surprised. He had already sensed the outcome when the meeting began. Removing emotion from his voice, he simply said, "Understood." As the meeting adjourned and the chairs scraped softly against the floor, Keanu stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun had dipped behind the rooftops, leaving streaks of burnt orange fading into blue. The community lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the quiet walk back to his home. His steps were steady, his mind clear. He would face whatever came next. What he didn't know was that fate was already shifting beneath their feet. Within a week, the same HOA that accused Shadow of being a threat would owe the dog their president's life. But for now, Keanu simply reached his front door, where Shadow waited with hopeful eyes and a gently wagging tail. Keanu knelt, pressing his forehead softly against the dog's. "We'll get through this," he murmured. And they would, but the path ahead would begin with a storm no one saw coming. The storm arrived earlier than forecasted, rolling in from the coastline like a dark, churning beast. By twilight, the sky had turned a bruised violet, streaked with violent forks of lightning that rattled windows and sent shivers through the quiet neighborhood. The wind howled between houses, bending tree branches and hurling leaves across empty streets. Most residents retreated indoors, lights dimmed, curtains drawn tight. But not everyone remained sheltered. In his home office, HOA President Harold Dalton stood by the window, annoyance etched across his face. He had received a maintenance alert earlier that day, a drainage issue near the walking trail behind the community. He had ignored it until the storm turned the oversight into a potential liability. Muttering under his breath about irresponsible landscaping contractors, Dalton grabbed a flashlight and a raincoat and stepped outside, determined to inspect the site himself before things got worse. The rain struck him immediately, sharp, cold, relentless. Dalton trudged through the muddy grass behind the houses, his flashlight beam slicing through sheets of water. The trail was slick, unstable in places, but he pressed on stubbornly. A mix of pride and frustration drove him. The idea of being held accountable for any damage irritated him more than the storm itself. As he neared the small wooden footpath leading toward the ravine, the ground trembled faintly beneath him, a subtle shift, like the earth exhaling. He froze. Then the soil gave way. In an instant, Dalton slipped, sliding down a steep, mud-coated embankment. His flashlight flew from his hand, vanishing into the darkness. He tumbled hard, hitting a protruding root before landing in a pool of cold water near the base of the ravine. A sharp pain exploded through his leg. Something had twisted or broken. He gasped, disoriented, the storm roaring above him. Dalton tried to climb, clawing desperately at the muddy incline, but the ground only crumbled beneath his fingers. Panic flared through him, not the kind born from fear of weather, but from a sudden realization of vulnerability. He was alone. His phone, soaked, flickered once and died in his hand. Rain hammered his face, blurring his vision. The cold seeped quickly into his bones as he sank back against the mud, breathing hard, limbs trembling. He shouted for help, but the wind devoured his voice, scattering it into nothing. A crack of thunder roared overhead. If someone didn't find him soon, hypothermia would claim him long before the storm passed. The irony wasn't lost on him. HOA president, keeper of order, enforcer of rules, now helpless, buried in chaos he couldn't control. Up the hill, several houses away, Keanu sat by his living room window, watching the storm with a sense of calm vigilance. Shadow lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the storm just as intensely. The dog's body was tense, not afraid, but alert, shoulders stiff, ears shifting at every low rumble. Keanu glanced down. "It's just a storm, buddy," he murmured, but Shadow didn't relax. He lifted his head slowly, nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply. Something in the air shifted, an odor faint but unmistakable to a trained rescue dog. Fear, adrenaline, distressed human scent. Shadow stood abruptly. Keanu frowned as the dog paced to the front door, whining softly, tail low but rigid, the way he only acted when someone was in danger. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the yard. Shadow barked, once, sharp, urgent, then pawed at the door. Keanu's instincts sharpened. He moved toward the door, but before he could secure it, a massive thunderclap shook the house. Shadow jumped back, then lunged forward, pushing against the partially latched gate outside. The wind slammed it open. Without hesitation, Shadow bolted into the storm, disappearing into the sheets of rain. "Shadow!" Keanu shouted, grabbing his jacket and flashlight as he sprinted after him. Shadow didn't run blindly. He ran with purpose, nose low, muscles coiled with determination. Keanu followed through the raging storm, heart pounding, each step sinking into mud. As he rounded the back fence line, he saw it. Shadow standing at the edge of the ravine, barking furiously down into the darkness. The urgency in the dog's voice told Keanu everything he needed to know. Someone was down there. He approached the ravine edge, flashlight trembling in his hand. When the beam finally locked onto the figure below, Keanu's breath caught. Half buried in mud, soaked and shivering, was Harold Dalton, his face pale with pain, eyes wide with fear. Shadow stood above him, barking for help that no human voice could have carried through the storm. The dog, labeled dangerous and unwanted, had found the very man who wanted him gone. And as the rain poured around them, it became clear this night would change everything. But for now, there was one mission: save a life before the storm claimed it. Shadow's bark echoed down into the ravine like a flare shot into the night. Sharp, urgent, purposeful. Keanu reached the muddy edge just as the wind whipped his jacket against him, rain soaking him to the bone. His flashlight beam jittered across the slope until it locked onto Harold Dalton lying twisted in the mud, one hand gripping a broken root, his face contorted in pain. The mud around him continued to erode with every drop of rain that hit the hillside. One more shift and Dalton could slip deeper into the ravine. Keanu crouched low, assessing the collapse with the calm precision of someone who had been in danger before. But Shadow was already acting. The dog descended the slope halfway, paws digging into the earth with practiced stability. He pressed himself against Dalton's side, not pushing, but anchoring, his body heat against Dalton's cold skin preventing the onset of shock. Dalton's hand reflexively clutched Shadow's fur, his earlier fear replaced by raw desperation and disbelief. "Harold, stay still, I've got you," Keanu shouted over the roar of the storm. His voice was steady despite the chaos. He moved carefully along the slick slope, every step measured, testing the ground before committing his weight. The mud sloshed beneath him, pulling at his boots. Lightning illuminated the ravine, revealing just how deep it ran. Dalton wasn't just injured, he was trapped in a place that would have swallowed him completely had Shadow not reached him in time. Keanu slid down a foot or two, bracing himself against the incline. "Shadow, hold," he commanded. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, didn't panic. He held perfectly still, trained, focused, aware of his role. Dalton shivered violently, looking up at Keanu. I can't move my leg," he stammered. "Feels like it snapped." Keanu nodded. "Don't. Help is coming." Keanu pulled his phone from his pocket, shielding it from the rain with both hands as he fought to wipe the screen dry enough to register touch. The signal was weak, but the emergency line connected. His voice was clipped, controlled, efficient as he relayed the location, the mudslide, Dalton's condition, and the urgency. "We have an unstable slope. One trapped, potential hypothermia. Send rescue now," the operator assured dispatch, but Keanu knew time was working against them. He pocketed his phone and descended another step, the mud sucking at his boot as though trying to claim him next. "Harold, listen to me," Keanu said, crouching as close as the slope allowed. "Stay awake. Keep your breathing steady. Shadow's keeping your core warm." Dalton looked down at the dog pressed against him, chest heaving, rain running in rivulets down Shadow's thick coat. I thought he was dangerous," Dalton whispered through clenched teeth. "He is," Keanu replied. "Dangerous to anything that threatens a life." Minutes felt like hours as the storm continued to rage. But then, sirens. Faint at first, swallowed by wind, then growing nearer. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, then barked twice. Sharp signals learned from rescue training to alert approaching responders. Flashlights appeared at the top of the ravine, followed by the silhouettes of fire and rescue personnel scanning the scene. "We see them," one called out. Another shouted down, "Hold tight. We're lowering a line." A rope dropped toward Keanu, who grabbed it and secured it around his waist. "I'm going to stabilize him until they reach us," Keanu told Dalton. Rescue workers descended with controlled speed, mud spraying outward as they carved footholds into the unstable slope. When they reached Dalton, they immediately checked his vitals, confirming a fractured leg and early-stage hypothermia. As they strapped Dalton into a rescue harness, one paramedic paused, glancing at Shadow. "Dog, keeping him warm." "Smart animal." Keanu gave a short nod. He found him. With a coordinated pull, Dalton was hoisted up the ravine, Shadow trotting along the path the rescuers carved, never leaving his side. Keanu climbed last, his muscles burning from tension and cold, but relief settling in once they reached solid ground. Dalton lay on a stretcher under the glow of emergency lights, rain still beating down as paramedics worked to stabilize him. His eyes searched for Keanu and Shadow, finding them standing together a few feet away. Shadow's posture calm, ears relaxed, but body still alert. Dalton swallowed hard. The man who had once tried to remove Shadow from a neighborhood now looked at him with awe, humility, and something deeper, a recognition of truth. Shadow wasn't the threat. Shadow was the protector. And Keanu knew this night would mark the shift. The story wasn't over, but the transformation had begun. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a neighborhood washed clean but shaken. Fallen branches littered the sidewalks, puddles reflected the pale dawn sky, and a faint scent of wet earth lingered in the air. Word of the night's rescue spread faster than the rainfall ever had. By noon, every resident knew. Harold Dalton, the strict, uncompromising HOA president, had nearly died in the ravine, and he had been saved not by the HOA's protocols or safety rules, but by the very dog he had labeled dangerous. By evening, the recreation center lights glowed once again, this time for an emergency meeting called by Dalton himself. The room buzzed with tension, curiosity, and a hint of embarrassment from those who had once whispered about Shadow with fear. Chairs filled quickly. Some stood along the back wall. No one wanted to miss whatever was about to unfold. Keanu arrived quietly, Shadow walking calmly at his side, the dog's coat now brushed and dry, though hints of dried mud still clung around his paws, a quiet badge of honor. As they entered, the room fell into a hush, not the hostile silence of the last meeting, but something closer to reverence. People shifted aside to let them pass. A few nodded respectfully. Keanu offered no dramatic gestures. He simply made his way to the front row, Shadow settling beside his chair like a sentinel carved from calm. Moments later, Harold Dalton appeared, supported by crutches, his right leg encased in a stabilizing brace. He moved slowly, every step a reminder of the night before. His face carried none of the stern detachment it once had. Instead, there was humility, real, unfiltered, vulnerable. Dalton reached the podium and set his crutches against the table. He took a moment to compose himself, clearing his throat as the room settled into breathless anticipation. "Last night," he began, voice wavering slightly, "I made a mistake. A serious one." His gaze moved toward Keanu and Shadow. "I thought I understood the risks in this community. I thought I knew what was dangerous and what wasn't." He exhaled shakily. "But the truth is, I was wrong." The admission rippled across the room. Dalton continued, describing the storm, the fall, the fear. And then, with emotion threatening to break through, he said, "I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for Shadow." At the mention of his name, Shadow lifted his head, ears perked but calm. Dalton's voice softened. "He stayed with me. He kept me warm. He alerted help. He saved my life." The room remained utterly still. No whispers, no skepticism, only the weight of collective realization. Dalton reached for a folder on the table and opened it. "Effective immediately," he announced, "the formal complaint filed against Mr. Reeves' dog is withdrawn." Applause rose instantly, not polite, but relieved, supportive, genuine. Dalton raised a hand gently, signaling there was more. "And additionally, I'm proposing we establish a volunteer program inspired by Shadow, aimed at community safety, emergency awareness, and animal welfare. We'll call it the Community Safety Animals Initiative." Gasps and murmurs of approval swept through the room. Even those who had once feared Shadow now nodded enthusiastically, acknowledging the dog's loyalty and value. Dalton turned toward Keanu. His voice softened, threaded with humility. "Mr. Reeves, Keanu, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe your dog my life." Keanu stood slowly, one hand resting lightly on Shadow. For a moment, the room waited for a speech, something grand and dramatic. But Keanu simply shook his head with a gentle, understanding smile. "No need for an apology," Keanu replied. His voice was steady, warm, carrying a quiet wisdom. "Shadow doesn't hold grudges. He protects. That's what he knows." He looked down at the dog, who gazed up at him with steadfast loyalty. He didn't need laws to tell him what was right. He just needed trust. A soft murmur of agreement filled the room. Keanu then gave a small nod to Dalton, one man acknowledging another not for authority, but for growth. Dalton, moved, placed a hand over his heart. The atmosphere shifted from formality to unity. For the first time in a long time, the HOA meeting room felt like a true community gathering, built not on rules or fines but understanding. Shadow lay peacefully at Keanu's feet as the applause returned, this time louder, richer, and directed not just at Keanu, but at the dog who had rewritten the neighborhood's perception with one heroic act. Even those who once feared him clapped with genuine admiration. Shadow blinked slowly, head tilted, not understanding the praise, only sensing the warmth in the room. Keanu knelt beside him, scratching behind his ear. "Good job, buddy," he whispered. The scene closed not with conflict or division, but with transformation. A neighborhood changed, a president humbled, and a dog finally seen for what he truly was: a guardian, a hero, a member of the community. And as the lights dimmed and people filed out, one truth lingered in every heart present: sometimes the thing we fear the most is the very thing that ends up saving us.